The topic for today's panel is progressivism, and I'm going to introduce the speakers we have to speak on progressivism on the left first, in order of their appearance. So we have Nelson Lichtenstein. Nelson Lichtenstein is a professor of history at UC Santa Barbara. His books focus on working class history, especially in regards to the collapse of the New Deal order over the 20th century. For 2 decades, he spearheaded the Center for the Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy. He has written articles for the New York Times, Dissent, and Jacobin. Then we'll also have Bert Mason, a member of the Spartacist League and a member of the Campaign to Release All Police Records.
No, Open All Police Archives.
Open All Police Archives. Thanks, Bert. And we have Marcello Pausa. Is that right?
Marcello Pausa.
Marcello Pausa, a founding member of the ACP and a chapter executive of the ACP, the American Communist Party. So, in order to introduce the panel, I'm not going to read the prompt the panelists are responding to. In his victory speech, Zohran Mamdani harkened back to 2 figures of the 20th century: Socialist Party of American presidential candidate Eugene Debs and New York City Mayor Fiorello La Guardia. Although both might be understood as figures of what has been termed the progressive era, they come from different periods. Debs and the SPA coincided with the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt and the Second International, whereas La Guardia was a figure of the New Deal and the collapse of the Socialist Party of America. Significantly, these periods straddle World War I, the Russian Revolution, and the emergence of the Third International. We ask our panelists, how do you view the relation between progressivism and socialism today? How do you view the relation between progressivism and socialism from the progressive era to the present day? How do you view the progressive era against the broader legacy of the American Revolution? And was this period, the progressive era, revolutionary? And if so, in what way? So, can we start out with you, Dr. Lichtenstein? Just take that mic.
Doesn't work.
I think you have to, there's a switch on the back of it.
Where?
I think you're on.
Hello? Work? Okay. Hi there. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and this is very stimulating. I'm delighted to see I'm old, but a new generation. That's great. Whatever. That's terrific. The questions that you asked, the way I sort of formulated the question was the first half of the 20th century, encompassing both the progressive era and the New Deal, revolutionary in any way? And I always used to tell my class, when that question would come up, the 30s, revolutionary, I'd say, what revolution are you talking about? Are you talking about the French Revolution, 1789, or the Bolshevik Revolution, as sort of models? And my answer would be, when it came to the French Revolution, that is a revolution seeking to create the rights of man and citizen, or man and woman, they used the word, they were gendered, but the citizenship, the expansion of citizenship, the destruction of kind of certain kinds of social hierarchies, informal and sometimes in law, that the progressive era, and then in particular the New Deal, and then also and I think now that we're in the year 2026, the 1960s and the 1930s look increasingly similar. They're one generation. I think if we look at that whole period, certainly the 30s to the 60s, we did have an expansion of citizenship, bourgeois rights, whatever you want to call it, and I think that was a progressive advance that unquestionably had transformed the expectations and consciousness of millions and millions of Americans. When it's a question of a Bolshevik-style revolution, let me just say, I think that at least certainly the answer is a big no from the point of view of historians and some activists and radicals and political people as well. So when FDR died in 1945, Labor Action, the newspaper of the Workers' Party, then an unorthodox Trotskyist sect, headlined, "Capitalism's greatest statesman dies." Okay? The New Deal was reformist, but it did more to stabilize capitalism than any other governing regime since the Civil War. And certainly compared to Europe of the 1930s, the New Deal seemed a salutary alternative, even from the point of view of many capitalists. As Joseph Kennedy, the Wall Street manipulator, father of John Kennedy, of course, who FDR put in charge of the Securities and Exchange Commission, once put it, "I'm happy to give half of my wealth to the government to ensure that the other half remains in my possession," and that of his family, and he did. A lot of historians, and especially those who began their careers in the New Left, came to the same conclusion, although they may have bemoaned it. Barton Bernstein wrote a once famous essay entitled "The Conservative Achievements of Liberal Reform." Labor historians like Steve Fraser, Christopher Tomlins, and myself argued that the labor question, and that was the phrase that was used from the 1877 for the next 50 years, really meaning the unsolved labor question, what are we going to do about it, which had once seemed so intractable, had been codified and bureaucratized once the Wagner Act had been passed, creating a species of routine collective bargaining. And the radicals who emerged within the economics profession saw Keynesianism in post-New Deal practice as a bastard policy that may have avoided another Great Depression, but which did little or nothing to create a more egalitarian political economy. And I don't have to tell you that most progressives thought of themselves as scientific racists. And the best that can be said about the New Deal policy on race and gender was one of benevolent abstention, with the possible exception of World War II, when the specter of a march on Washington led by African-American trade unionists frightened FDR into promulgating the executive order that created the Fair Employment Practices Commission, designed to integrate war production jobs. And of course, the New Deal gave rise to the American century, another way of saying American imperialism, even if in some places and times it was an imperialism by invitation, Europe mainly. One consequence of all this was the demise first of the Socialist Party and then of the Communists. As Norman Thomas put it after the SP vote cratered in 1936, Roosevelt stole our program. And of course, it was the New Deal state, of which the FBI was one of its proudest products, that smashed the communists, beginning in early 1940 when CP leader Earl Browder was imprisoned for lying about his foreign travels. But my generation's experience with Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, and now Zohran Mamdani has made us reshuffle some of the argumentative data points, largely in the direction of both validating reform in and of itself, and also seeing some reforms, and here I'm going to talk about Trotsky's transitional program of 1938, as linked to a larger transformation of society. What's become clear in the last 40 years is that institutions and policies we once thought functional to capitalism are not. Here's two examples. We used to think, and some of this was said, I think, in the panel earlier today, we used to think that trade unionism was easily incorporated into a system whereby the unions functioned as part of the firm's industrial relations apparatus, resolving grievances, winning modest wage increases, mobilizing workers into the Democratic Party, etc. All that was functional to capitalism. But it turns out that any functionality the trade unions might have enjoyed is of far less importance than once thought. And so virtually every sector of capitalism today fights unionism, including the most conservative sort, and all with the legal and economic resources at its command. And that was actually as true as the late 1940s when in another book I discussed the various denunciations of the AFL, just as bad as the CIA, no difference from the point of view of capitalists. Second is the idea of full employment, and more generally, the welfare state. Liberals thought that Keynesian planning would stabilize capitalism and pacify the working class. But there were limits to that program, which Michael Kalecki, a Polish-trained Marxist economist, spelled out during World War II. At a certain point, capitalists will go on strike, so to speak, when they can't discipline the working class, either by shifting capital to a new venue or by periodic bouts of recessionary unemployment. During the war, capitalists were making a ton of money, but as Mark Wilson has shown in a recent book, disruptive creation, American business, and the winning of World War II, U.S. capitalists became increasingly alienated from the New Deal state during that era, culminating in Taft-Hartley and the Red Scare. All this has relevance to the transitional program put forward by Leon Trotsky in 1938. Trotsky distinguished between a minimal program, quote, which limited itself to reforms within the framework of bourgeois society, and the maximum program, which promises substitution of socialism for capitalism in the indefinite future. Neither worked. The first might be that of our recently celebrated sewer socialists. The latter was truly pie in the sky. Instead, he wanted a transitional program that linked the two. Such transitional demands did two things. They united the working class behind a program that was immediately realizable and beneficial, and thus enlarged support for socialism. And these demands stressed the capitalists, endangered the capitalists in such a way as to create a crisis that could only be resolved by ending the logic of the market, profit-maximizing economy, and thus opening the door for the working class to achieve real power. The particular transitional demands that Trotsky put forward came out of a catalog of existing labor and reform ideas present since the early years of the 20th century. Among them were, quote, a sliding scale of wages linked to inflation, a right to employment through the government creation, public knowledge of what he called business secrets, by which he elaborated projects for limiting the autocracy of the economic royalists, and that's an FDR phrase which Trotsky picks up on. Am I okay on time?
Yeah.
You're looking at me.
Yeah.
You're looking at me suspiciously.
You got a couple minutes.
Okay. Limiting the autocracy of economic royalists will continue to be pathetic farces as long as private owners of the social means of production can hide from producers and consumers the machinations of exploitation, robbery, and fraud. The abolition of, quote, business secrets is the first step toward the actual control of industry. That's Trotsky, 1930. As it turned out, none of these transitional demands were sufficient to bring on a crisis of capitalism, but they were very much in line with a laborite New Deal. During the next decade, quote, the sliding scale of wages became embodied in COLA, which the UAW Local 4811 was fighting for desperately. You know, I always said they're fighting for what the UAW wanted in 1955. I mean, you know, but it was but today it's actually a radical demand. They call COLA. Public works to unemployment came in World War II, and the abolition of business secrets was embodied in the investigative work completed in 1939 and 40 by the Temporary National Economic Commission, a tremendously radical government investigating body, and by Walter Reuther's 1945 demand that General Motors, quote, open the books to show that post-war wage increases could come with no increase in the price of cars. And today, in the work of the Federal Trade Commission under the recent leadership of Lina Khan, and capitalists really do hate Lina Khan, but you know, there she is, okay. She's not a socialist, okay. So capitalists did indeed oppose all this, but none of it was fatal to the system. One lesson here is that the differences between social democrats, which well describes Norman Thomas, Bernie Sanders, and Zohran Mamdani, is not all that different from democratic socialists, or as Trotsky and his followers would have it, revolutionary socialism. At least in the New Deal practice, and at least given the steps A, B, C, and D. Maybe Z and X are another story, but A, B, C, the steps are the same. They aren't that different. Given the comparisons many are making between Mamdani and both the Milwaukee socialist mayors and New York's La Guardia, a word about electoral politics and governance of cities and municipalities. Be sure to get me when I'm going to have time.
You got about 3-4 minutes.
Oh, that's all. Okay.
3 minutes.
The general rule here is that in the progressive era, there were a lot of socialist city governments, not just in Milwaukee, but in Berkeley, Reading, Schenectady, Flint, and elsewhere. In the hundreds, but very briefly. That direct electoral tradition, and it was, you know, people being elected, you know, mayor in 1970, ended with the 1930s. There was Upton Sinclair's End Poverty in California campaign of 1934. So Sinclair had been a socialist, he ran as a Democrat, but he was considered a socialist. And in New York City, there was a lot of socialists and communists won seats on the city council. But mainly in the 1930s, and this is important, one of my most important points, local election victories arose out of the mobilization of union labor. Progressives, either as New Deal Democrats or farmer laborers or some other party, won office propelled there by the new unionism. They were labor's offspring, not unionism's parent. That was the opposite of the progressive era, when socialists got elected and then they tried to have local laws that helped unions. But in the 30s, it was the union came first, and then the electoral victory. In western Pennsylvania, dozens of steel and coal towns were swept by the CIO in the mid-30s. I'm going to talk about that in a second. In Oakland, after the general strike in 1946, it was the AFL unions organized a faction within the city to wrest control from the reactionary Nolan Oakland Tribune element. And in Michigan, the UAW waged a civil war within the Democratic Party to seize control from the Teamsters backed faction and the business elements that were with it. Okay, I'm running out of time. Okay. I have a new book called Why Labor Unions Matter. Buy it in about 6 months, and you can read all about this. But in western Pennsylvania, which had been run by Republicans, every little steel town, Aliquippa, Homestead, they were just feudal fiefdoms. Talking about the French Revolution, I mean, this was before the French Revolution. The WASP elite connected to the steel companies ran the show, and the Slavic and black and Hungarian, workers were just at the bottom of the pile. What you had in western Pennsylvania, and that was all true during the 20s, before the 20s, etc. You had first the formation of the Steelworkers Organizing Committee and the revival of the United Mine Workers into vigorous militant unions, and then you have electoral victories in the mid-1930s, and when people were elected to office in these victories, they weren't elected as Democrats. They were elected as CIO Democrats, or as steelworker Democrats, or as militants without, as just being a unionist party. Here was example. It was not conscious. It wasn't some strategy of working within the Democrats like the DSA has today. But it came out organically out of the power of the union to mobilize its membership and take control of the city. And when they did that, they got rid of Jim Crow. They paved the streets finally of the working class districts. They curbed the police, which they often called the Cossacks. In western Pennsylvania, Cossacks were from Russia. They were the Tsar's police. I'm finished. I'm almost finished. They were the Tsar's police, and they curbed that. So you had, I think, a de facto labor parties in all the industrial cities of the North. Now that laughed out. Now the problem was, of course, that would fade with the bureaucratization of the unions, the conservatism that emerged, and eventually it would fade. But that, I think, is the model that we want today, and I think the potential for the revival of the union movement has that model with it in terms of electoral politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lichtenstein. All right, so now we have Bert Mason who's going to give his opening remarks.
All right. I think I got to turn this thing on, right?
Yep.
There we go. Does that work? Yeah, I think so. First off, I'd like to thank Ishmael and Platypus for inviting my organization, the Spartacist League, to today's panels. In order to advance the historical interests of the working class, it's vitally necessary to have discussions and debates in the left to determine the best courses of action for social struggle, while seeking all possible opportunities to engage in common activities to defend the workers and oppressed. This panel is about progressivism and the left. Rather than focus on the historical side of the question, I'd like to jump right in and address the progressive movement that is most animating the left at this time, Zohran Mamdani. I hope to lay out what Mamdani mania represents in American politics and pose some of the tasks facing the left now that he is mayor of New York City. Everyone knows that Mamdani's campaign struck a chord in NYC and beyond, drawing in 100,000 volunteers to stump for him and winning some support among sections of the working class and unions. The reason is simple. He calls to freeze some rents, make buses free, expand child care, and oppose the Zionist genocide of the Palestinians, demands massively popular among leftist and oppressed communities. All of this led to a huge backlash from the bankers and landlords, as well as the Democratic Party establishment. But before the ballots were even cast, Mamdani began to flip the switch. He met with Wall Street tycoons to convince them that his program would not threaten their profits. Now in office, he pledges to work with the billionaires and landlords so hated by the working people. How did this happen? How could a self-declared democratic socialist so unceremoniously dump his avowed ideals and turn on his own supporters? The answer is that in assuming office as a representative of the Democratic Party, a party of U.S. capitalist imperialism, Mamdani showed in advance that he would not cross any red lines that could seriously challenge the ruling class. Instead, he has taken his place alongside the ruling class. Like Bernie and AOC, Mamdani's role is to pull workers and oppressed back into the hated Democratic fold. Much of the left has gone gaga over Mamdani. The Party for Socialism and Liberation openly embraces him. Socialist Alternative demands that he become New York City's organizer-in-chief to lead a mass movement independent of the Democratic Party. DSA left-wingers view his campaign as a model for building up socialist forces within the party of the class enemy. Let's get real. Mamdani's mission is not to unleash social struggle, but to contain it in channels acceptable to the ruling class. And what mass movement is Mamdani leading? He criticized Trump's attack on Venezuela and opposed Maduro's capture, but where are all the activists who built his campaign? Why aren't they being mobilized to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn to demand Maduro's release? That is a red line that Mamdani will not cross. And what about the New York nurses strike going on right this minute? Well, Mamdani did a photo up on the picket lines and said he supports the strikers. He promised to help the bosses keep the hospitals open with scab labor in the name of quote-unquote continuity of care. The left strategy of liberal coalition building is a dead end because it subordinates the struggle for working class interests to alliances with politicians whose job is to uphold the capitalist system. But it was the liberal Democrats who presided over the joblessness, inflation, homelessness, and drug addiction that drove millions of workers into Trump's arms. Now the left claims that Mamdani's election signals a leap in class consciousness and shows that working class New Yorkers are ready to battle the billionaires. This claim is baseless. Where are the masses of workers when Trump attacks Venezuela or ICE executes Renee Good? By claiming that their alliance with Mamdani has been a success, the left is repeating yesterday's failures yet again. Such claims isolate the left from the workers and are no way to get the workers on their feet. To the extent that they have criticisms, leftists counsel Mamdani not to kowtow to the powers that be. Many know that he's not likely to hold the line on affordable housing, free public transportation, or much else, but blame this on establishment politicians blocking his way. Yes, vested interests will try to sabotage Mamdani's plans, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is that as a capitalist politician, he will not put up a class fight against those vested interests. He is not a helpless victim of the state machine but its executive overseer. The job of a real socialist mayor would not be to play power politics in City Hall, but to use the office as a platform to fight for a class struggle perspective. Working class struggle is the key force capable of throwing a wrench in Trump's nonstop attacks, but it is a distant prospect at present thanks to the role of the labor leaders in crippling the unions in order to maintain their alliance with the capitalist Democrats. From LA and Washington, D.C., to Chicago and Portland, the labor leaders have done nothing to unleash the unions to stop ICE. California SEIU President David Huerta still faces criminal charges for protesting ICE, but the union tops haven't lifted a finger to mobilize mass support to drop the charges. This is the bitter fruit of the partnership of liberals and labor, which perpetuates the never-ending dog and pony show of the two-party system that prevents the working class from becoming an independent force for itself. A real socialist mayor would take the lead in defending the oppressed black population. But Mamdani has done exactly the opposite, pledging to retain New York's deeply segregated elite public schools that shut their doors to black and Latino students. How are you going to improve housing or expand childcare if you don't champion the needs of the oppressed, disproportionately forced into rat-infested apartments and deprived of social services? Our campaign to open all police archives addresses the felt need of black people to end police brutality. And Mamdani, he used to denounce NYPD as racist, but apologized for this and then selected Zionist pig Jessica Tisch to stay on as police commissioner. Boo. Boo. This means flooding the streets with more cops. In upholding the racist status quo, Mamdani is following a familiar liberal playbook of driving a wedge between black and other sections of the working class. Instead, revolutionaries link the defense of the oppressed to the defense of the whole working class and fight for black gains that come at the expense of the bosses, not white workers. With enormous illusions in Mamdani, leftists inside and outside the DSA see his victory as a model for regenerating America. So let's put this to the test. Anyone claiming to be a socialist must oppose racist cop violence and defend the oppressed against the thugs in blue. Socialists should demand that Mamdani dump Tisch and appoint a police commissioner dedicated to opening all police archives and jailing the killer cops. Furthermore, leftists should demand that Mamdani must refuse to enforce or support the New York State Taylor Law, which outlaws strikes by government workers. This is the program put forward by the Just Break Already caucus in DSA, a group we in the Spartacist League support, whose objective is to break DSA from the Democrats and split left-wing DSAers from the rightist pro-democratic leadership. That's not the approach of the American Communist Party, and perhaps you can speak to this, which makes do with denouncing Mamdani and criticizing from the sidelines. You can't win over those in the DSA, which is an organization of 100,000 people, that many of which think that they're socialist. You can't win over those in DSA who strive to be socialist without intervening in the organization against the liberal leaders. What's needed today is not another iteration of the progressive era, which was superseded by the greatest victory ever for the world working class, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Nor do we need another FDR in Mamdani clothing. What's necessary is a fight to break from the Democrats and the capitalist two-party system as part of forming a revolutionary workers' party that champions the interests of the working class and oppressed. Thank you.
Thanks, Bert, and now we're going to have Marcello speak his opening remarks. Hello?
There we go. So I would say I broadly agree with the analysis here by Professor Lichtenstein. I would like to comment then on what you said about our party, but
Fair enough.
let's say, what is missing from Lichtenstein's argument, which is very broad and comprehensive, and I do not think it's missing just because he is unaware of it, is the Populist Party coming up.
The Populist Party?
The Populist Party.
Mid- 1890s? Or
Yes, in the 1890s. Now, the origins of FDR actually come in from populist fusion candidates with Democrats and populists. Now, the point of the Populist Party was that it was a farmers' movement that was trying to solve the issues that farmers were facing of the day, right? Now, farmers were being immiserated. They had been immiserated over the course of the 1800s. And the big issue that they had was that they were forced into debt peonage. They had to pay loans, and because of the gold standard, as the value of goods dropped, that drove up, basically it deflated their the money. So if you were selling goods one day for $1, you'd be selling them for a penny the next day, and so they couldn't close the gap on a loan of, say, $100. So they were trying to mobilize around moving towards the silver standard. Now, as you'll note, that is not really a working class position, right? The working class wants to drive down value and wants to drive up the price of their labor, right? If they're getting paid the same amount and everything stagnates, right? If you have things matched with inflation, then the value of goods goes down and they can buy more things. But neither of these movements really met together. There was never really a discussion between these things. We spent a lot of time looking into what the SPA was doing at the time. We were looking into what the CPUSA was doing at the time with regards to farmers, and it was a completely neglected question. That is not the case within the Bolshevik movement, right? Within the Bolshevik Party, they made the peasantry a very primary class. Now, they said that was because well, it was predominantly peasant, but within our analysis, my analysis with, of America at that time, the reason why FDR was able to subvert the socialist movement, as Mr. Lichtenstein, or Professor Lichtenstein went ahead and outlined, was because, well, workers just need to be satisfied within their own realm of material conditions. They're not working together with someone else. What did FDR do at the same time was he introduced the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which basically benefited big agro. They had to sell off, because even though the Dust Bowl was going on, the amount of food that was being produced was actually far in excess of what was helpful to the bourgeoisie. And so they paid people to burn their excess. Now, a small farmer does not have excess to burn. And so the big agriculture was benefited greatly, and those farm workers that were suffering under the Dust Bowl, were suffering under debt peonage and so on, were forced off of their farms and forced into tenements constructed by FDR. Now, within the Bolshevik movement, you had the construction of the Soviets, and you had the broad agricultural demands of the peasants. The motivation was peace, land, and bread. That was the slogan of the Bolshevik Party, and when the Bolsheviks came into power, eventually Stalin, after the collectivization, put the emphasis on the kolkhoz, which greatly empowered the average farm worker. Now, the common narrative of collectivization in the Kolkhozs was either it smashed the peasantry at the time. Well, that was the kulaks and so forth. That was a group of people who had got wealth under the NEP and used it to start enslaving their neighbors. Now, when quotas were introduced and so on, they would burn their excess in order to force the Soviet government to do one thing or another. So the Kolkhozs really had nothing much to do with that group of people. Now, within the collectivization critique that says that it's state enforced and so on, that comes afterwards actually with Khrushchev and enforced collectivization. Actually, under the Kolkhozs, it was freer, they could sell their produce on a free market, so on and so forth. Now, that is just a solution that the Soviets came up with that greatly benefited the peasantry. Within America, there was no solution posited by the Communist Party, there was no solution posited by the Socialist Party, and so the solution that was brought to the table, the minor maybe solutions here and there from the Socialists, what was actually brought forward was the solution brought forward by the financialists. And this brings us to the character of FDR's state. What FDR would do is he would offer amelioration to certain issues within the working class, and in exchange you would lose a piece of your leverage. So for instance, we'll institute the NLRB. Well, okay, now that the NLRB is in place, you can't, now you have to go through arbitration and so forth, and it decreases power and these and that. Now, actually, he did Professor Lichtenstein, again, I want to very much thank you for going through very well that process. Now, to the union question, and this also begins to talk about the criticism you have. The issue we have in this country is that we do not have that broad union movement yet. We do have Teamsters, we do have UAW, but they don't represent that same broad force that the CIO did. Now, the CIO represented that force because they were organized by the Communist Party. It was very, very effective for the time. Now, the problem with the CIO comes in when, during the McCarthy era, they arrest the communists who are in charge, and then they merge it with the AFL, and they turn it into a business union. And that begins the compromise of the labor movement across the United States. Now, leading into the civil rights era, you have the union movement in the South that the communists spearheaded. The unionization of sharecroppers and the unionization of tobacco field workers and tobacco product manufacturers. That was largely black and provided the foundation for the civil rights movement in a lot of ways. Now, what are we looking at today? We're looking at Mamdani, and he is going along and doing the same thing that every other politician before him has done. Why are we not on the streets right now and protesting? Now, I do believe that the New York chapter is protesting in support of Maduro, releasing him. Now, the issue is, we're not very large. The union movement isn't very powerful because, well, it doesn't have a vision like it did back in the 30s. Now, that vision was being offered by the Soviet Union. One of the reasons why the compromise came forward was because of, hey, the denunciation of Stalin by Trotsky in the 20s and the denunciation of Stalin in the 60s by Khrushchev. That kind of weakens that vision. Now, what am I going to fight for? Well, I'm going to protect what I have. So,
2 minutes, by the way.
Excellent. So why aren't we out there? Well, we're not very powerful. Why We have sent some people, we just don't have a lot. In the same instance, why don't we have a broad socialist movement? Because the union movement isn't very strong. And that union movement needs to be built up, and it needs to be built up in tandem with a new farmers movement. Now the farmers are equally crushed. The unions are crushed. There is not a lot of leverage in that movement. However, the leverage which they could hold would be in mobilizing the labor and money that they have to begin the process of reindustrializing this country themselves. Something that they need that the capitalists are pretending to offer them and can't do. They could open up their own factories and so on. They have that money, they have those resources, but they don't have that vision, and they don't know how such a thing would be accomplished. But that would be the basis, for instance, of a Bolshevik revolution in the United States.
Okay, thank you to our panelists. So now we're going to have a brief period for the panelists to respond to each other, take 2 or 3 minutes to respond to each other's remarks and arguments, and address any concerns you have floating around before we turn over the floor to the audience, and I'll have a big conversation. So, would you like to respond, Dr. Likenstein?
Just a few, a few things. Just one thing. I would just say that this Mamdani, we are thinking about Mamdani and everything. The problem is essentially not. This is not a brief for the Democrats. I spent most of my life attacking the Democrats, etc., looking for some way to have an independent party of labor or something. But the problem essentially is not that there's a sort of the Democratic Party is some Leninist formation which tells Mamdani this or that. The problem is capital. Every mayor who gets elected, there have been other progressive mayors who have been elected in New York, other places, LA, Chicago right now. They're all faced with austerity, and they're all faced with a kind of the threat. I mentioned this of a capitalist strike, as it were. We're leaving, we're moving. We're not going to reinvest, etc. That's the problem, and really, I think it's on a city level. It's really almost insoluble. You can't create a socialist utopia or social democratic utopia in New York City by itself. So that's the essential problem. I'm not going to sort of disagree with you about the character of the Democratic Party and all sorts of people, but I just think what's the issue? The issue is capital fleeing or blackmailing or that sort of thing, and then of course the structure of taxation and of revenues, etc., is all basically makes it very difficult at the city level and even the state level. Which is why we need a national movement of a sort. Now I do think, as I said, I was making this point about Trotsky's transitional program. I do think the distinction that is sometimes made between social democratic demands and socialist demands is really not there. I think that they both link together, and I think insofar as you can win something, then you mobilize. The only second point I want to make is this about the unions and such. Yeah, I've written you have no idea how many books I've written denouncing the character of the union movement. By the way, I wrote a whole book about World War II about the bureaucratization of the unions in World War II. Mm-hmm. That was the problem, not the expulsion of the communists. I thought that was an issue too. But today, just look around. Capital is hostile to workers forming unions. Period. I said that. I can say, that is an issue. That is the first issue before we talk about all sorts of other questions. And maybe your argument might be, well, if you have the right program and we put it forward, then workers are going to flock into a union. Well, there's a lot of obstacles to that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the task of the left today, certainly the task of this left, my left, is the revitalization and expansion of the trade union movement, which faces enormous obstacles. So I'll stop.
What do you have to say about that, Bert, of Dr. Lichtenstein's characterization of the issue?
All right. Actually, I'm going to try to make 2 points, if my time isn't too short for that. The one is to Nelson's point, all mayors face austerity, and that at the city level, it's an unsolvable problem. One of the issues being that if the capitalists get angry enough, they'll flee. Well, nobody could deny that. Of course, this is true. If you're operating within the framework of a capitalist party, which is what the Democrats are, and you view your role as simply to tweak the system and make it work to the best of your ability, but you're willing to accept the class domination of the capitalists and the capitalist nature of your own party, of course you cannot in any way whatsoever address the question of austerity and capital flight. That can only be done with a revolutionary working class perspective. There's no doubt in the world that Wall Street and the landlords are going to try to sabotage some of Mamdani's extremely modest program. But the problem is that Mamdani's starting point is to work within the system. If you're working within the system, you can't address the questions that Nelson is raising here. You need to have a perspective that goes beyond what's acceptable to the capitalist ruling class. That is, as I said in my little thing, that is a red line that Mamdani will not cross. And that line that Mamdani will not cross is the line that the history of all progressivism and liberalism in America has followed for decades and decades. And that is that red line that prevents the working class from being a force for itself in its own independent class interest. That's why I'm sitting up here with a different counterposed alternative to that idea that you work within the system. Well, you can't do very much about austerity, so we're going to have to, accept it or do the best we can to make do with it. That's Mamdani's approach because he's a capitalist politician. That is not the revolutionary approach that is going to win gains for the working class. Do I have any more time?
That's good.
I'll talk later. Okay.
Yeah, you'll have it. Good. Marcello?
So, with regards to austerity, one of the issues of the day is that the falling rate of profit has really caught up with us. There is just not a lot of value in the system. So when we talk about what it would be that, say, a politician in the 1950s of Mamdani's character might do, he would be reallocating value. There isn't much value to reallocate. So of course he can't do anything, right? I mean, to your point, we can't do anything by coming up and saying, I've got a great idea. What if no, there's no money for it in some sense, right? There's no value in our system, and the reason why there is no value is because that value has been systematically destroyed. It has been destroyed by finance in order to raise that rate of profit, but the falling rate of profit has really caught up with them. Silicon transistor chips were the last thing generating profit on a large scale. Once they hit miniaturization, now they're not really making profit anymore. And I can tell you, my specialization in college was actually microchip design. I graduated college right after silicon transistor chips hit miniaturization, and so my field is empty. Now it is about moving the transistors around to be slightly more efficient, and they're doing that with AI. So they don't really need me. So why is it then that the unions are so valuable? It's because where value comes from is labor itself. So if you don't have value, right, so if we're going to do, was it Ronald Reagan, you run out of other people's money to spend? Well, we need more value. So we need labor to build again. We need labor to make cars in the United States at scale again. We need to be making more and more products. Consumer electronics should be manufactured in this country and not in China, and so on. And if we had that, then we would have something to compromise. If you're going to be a social democrat, you need something to compromise. So you need that. But a social democrat is already compromising for themselves. And so they're compromising with finance, and finance is not going to industrialize. So they can't deliver on anything. So kind of the only alternative then is to rebuild value. And whoever it is that can rebuild that value, that being the unions, which represent the working class, should be in charge. However, they need to, yeah, sure, I can say they would need to also account for the agricultural question. So I can wrap it up there, and if that needs to be drawn out.
That's good. Okay, thank you to all of our panelists. Have a round of applause. And now we'll take some questions from the floor. Gentleman up front. Hand up early.
Yeah.
Do we have a mic runner?
Test. Can you hear me? Okay. So, if asked by most people nowadays how they might characterize Bernie, AOC, or Mamdani, they would most likely be characterized as progressives. And Marcello, you had brought up the populist movement pre-World War I, and Bert used the expression FDR in Mamdani clothing. And Nelson, you had also talked about the achievements of the organized labor faction of the FDR and New Deal era. I guess one thing that's maybe not mentioned so much here is the progressive movement pre-World War I, starting a little bit later, a bit after the populists, but also before FDR. It seems that the original progressive era, which I assume is distantly in people's mind when they call Bernie, AOC, and Mamdani progressives, was not really mentioned. So I guess my question to you three might be, what specific lessons, positive or negative, do the original progressives, saying like Teddy Roosevelt, Wilson, the progressive movement, like the reforms they had in the movement in the pre-World War I era, what lessons do those progressives offer the left today?
Who'd like to respond to that?
Yeah, there's a reason. Actually, I would characterize AOC, Mamdani, and Bernie not as progressives, but as social democrats. And I think they sort of said that. And actually, Mike Kazin had a piece in the I don't know where it was, the Center, New York Republic, someplace, making that point. But that's just nomenclature. You know, I'll tell you, I have never been wild about the progressive era. Okay, I've never thought that was the model for the left. In a way, there are some people, some liberals, E.J. Dionne. It's sort of it was technocratic. Certainly, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson would not rise very high in our regard these days. The progressives wanted to modernize capitalism. There's no doubt about that. In that sense, I completely I completely agree with any critique you guys have had. My main point, and I'll stop. My main point here is. We have to mobilize and organize the working class, and that is not the case right now. And when you said, crossing the red line, Mamdani he hasn't crossed the red line. Okay, let's assume he does cross the red line. And he has a party, your favorite party, Labor Party. What would that mean? It wouldn't mean anything if he didn't have a mobilized support that's organized in some fashion, either through unions or the party itself or community groups or what have you. That's what needs. That's the task of the immediately in front of us. The progressives, by the way, were not interested in that. Frankly, they were kind of anti-union in many ways, and they were waspy. They were rationalizers. They were better than the Gilded Age people, but it's the New Deal where you find the issue. I always make one last point. The reason we're in this room today, that you and your ancestors, as it were, were interested in these particular questions. It comes out of that moment of working class mobilization and organization, which lasted for a generation, and it was in that context that we could talk about revolutions and socialism and all sorts of, but without that, you know, it doesn't happen. And so I think that's why I look at the New Deal rather than the Progressive Era as my baseline.
Would either of the other panelists like to respond to that question?
I'm okay.
Yeah, I think to follow up, any lessons that can be gained from the Progressive Era are really minor. So if you look, for instance, at those parties that, like the SPA and those and so on and so forth, even the Communist Party of the United States, there's a lot to learn there, but they took a lot for granted. They had a built-up and industrialized country. We're in a deindustrialized state. So figuring out how it is you build unions you build up a big, powerful labor movement, that means a completely different thing now than it did back then. There was a massive industrial engine in the United States that was whirring and had been whirring for 100 years. We're slowed down quite a lot. So there are lessons to take from the socialist organizations. I agree wholeheartedly with the other groups, Woodrow Wilson and so on. Very negative, I believe, in a lot of ways in history. But yeah, other than what not to do, minor ways of talking with labor unions, building up mass support, critiques of, it's niggly details and not broad strokes. We're missing the broad strokes.
But Progressive Era, the one thing that you found with Progressive feminism. Feminism came out of the Progressive Era, very vigorous, key ideas. The New Deal was terrible on feminism, by the way. So you still, I mean, there are the Progressive Era does have that, and that's important. And then it reemerges, of course, in the late '60s. So, and in fact, some of the same generation, the generation of radical women who were active in the '30s and later, really, they came out of the Progressive Era. That was the formative moment for the rise of feminism, really in the 20th century.
Bert, what's the old Spartacist line on Wilson and also Teddy Roosevelt, and why should us young people care or not care about like the old Spartacist line on Wilson or Teddy Roosevelt?
Well,
we got a question here.
Let's just have briefly answer that, and then we're going to take another question from the audience.
I really think I could. Is that on? No, I don't think so.
Racism.
I really think I could keep it very brief. There is no such thing as a Spartacist line on Teddy Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson. I will just tell you, Teddy Roosevelt was probably among U.S. presidents the key guy to usher in the epic of U.S. imperialism. Keep in mind it was the Spanish-American War, the occupation and the seizure of the Philippines. That's Teddy Roosevelt. Woodrow Wilson was a well-known segregationist, racist pig. So that's my take on those two guys.
We agree.
Okay. The gentleman right there with his hand up. Sunglasses on his neck. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess hearing all of your responses, one thing that isn't quite clear to me is if there's a coherent definition of progressivism that you all could agree on across different historical eras, and I think that's what the last question was trying to get at. Apologies. So I guess one thing that I might observe is that we could refer to the era of Teddy Roosevelt as being progressive, right? That was the original historical progressive era, a sort of class collaboration with the existing capitalist state. We could also refer to the period of FDR and the New Deal as progressive. That's another era that's been referred to as progressive. Now in the case of international politics, there's the idea of the progressive forces, industrial versus fictive capital, right? Where we might call one group of capitalists progressive as opposed to another. And then lastly, in the 60s and 70s, you see the emergence of progressivism and the new social movements. Now, I guess one implicit through line in calling each of these things progressive might be the identification of the capitalist state with progress in one form or another. Do you agree that that would characterize progressivism as a consistent ideology? What do you all think about that?
Well, I'll go first, and then I'll allow my interlocutors here. But in my opinion, and my view of progressivism is that it is extremely vague. It doesn't really mean anything when you're talking about any common parlance. You go to a different place, they'll be talking about a different thing. When you hear it used in public, I would generally categorize that as big tent opportunism. I'm the good guy. For what reason? Because I'm progressive. What does that mean? Well, something is going to change, right? What? Exactly. Of course things are going to change, right? What does it mean to be in a progressive stance? Well, I wake up tomorrow and the sun comes up again. That doesn't, it's not helpful. But when we're talking about in these situations, okay, maybe it might mean something specific, depending on who you're talking to. But to use it in any kind of common parlance is not helpful.
Yes, please.
I'm a little puzzled by your interest in progressivism. Okay, fine. I mean, I could go on for 2 hours on it, but I can't stop. I mean, there's no consistent progressivism. There's nothing consistent about the definition of progressivism. There isn't. Period. There's a left. There's a right. There's a up. There's a down. There's a feminist. There's a racist. There's all sorts. There's nothing. It was an effort, I think, to rationalize capitalism. Who's heard of Frederick Taylor in this room? Okay. Frederick Taylor's a progressive, all right? He was trying to figure out how to make workers work harder, that using science. That was progressivism, okay? At the same time, Jane Addams and Frances Perkins, who were interested in the welfare of working women, they were also progressive. There was a way of, they wanted to figure out how to make capitalism function in a more, rational, efficiency was also one of the big themes, and of course they had a whole racial hierarchy, and so imperialism fit easily into progressivism. But I just don't think it's a model for us. There are some liberals out there today. I said E.J. Dionne and a few others who want. Let's look back to Teddy Roosevelt. He wanted to smash the trust and all that. But I don't think it's our model. I really don't. That's my view.
Okay. We have right there, right behind the phone camera.
Would you like to?
Well, I did actually want to say a word about that.
Okay, why don't you just briefly give your thoughts, Bert,
All right.
and a question.
I think that the classic example of quote-unquote progressivism in this country is FDR. What did FDR do? He's much vaunted today by much of the left as well for the New Deal. But what was the New Deal? The New Deal was a method to preserve and protect American capitalism at the time of the Great Depression. In other words, at a moment of peril for U.S. capitalism. It's also intersected the great strike waves actually of the 1930s. But the other thing that the New Deal did was it paved the way for World War II, U.S. imperialist domination of the planet in its victory over Nazi Germany. We Trotskyists, by the way, were defenders of the Soviet Union against the imperialist countries.
Not this one.
But now I want to. What do we? But the real thing we should be talking about here is not FDR. We should be talking about what is progressivism today. It means an effort by a guy like Mamdani or Bernie Sanders or AOC or the DSA electeds in the Los Angeles City Council, whose job is to protect the system in the face of very great potential challenges. I say potential because it's not really coming to a head right at this moment. The things that Mamdani is addressing, housing, public transportation, all of those things, are issues that could lead to social explosions. And Mamdani's goal and his objective is to contain those pressures. And that's why there are sections of the Democratic Party establishment which have made their peace with him. So the question comes down to what is the working class need to be able to get the things that Mamdani is raising his modest demands about? But how are you going to get better housing? How are you going to fight against Zionism in Gaza? It is by an independent mobilization of the working class. But Mamdani and his left supporters, meaning in the DSA and all the left groups that I mentioned a few minutes ago, they stand on the opposite side. They are not for an independent mobilization of the working class. They're for directing struggle back into the path of a liberal progressive who's going to keep the whole thing contained within, bounds acceptable to the capitalist ruling class and their particular politicians. So that's why I keep posing the need for the struggle against liberal coalition building and the need to fight for the independence of the working class. I have more to say, but I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Okay, so to me it seems like there's generally widespread consensus on the critique of unionism, progressivism, Mamdani, and so other, in existing America, and FDR. So amongst all panelists, there seems to be agreement there. What I'd like to hear about a little bit more, and I think was briefly touched on, was what is the positive vision for each panelist? How do we achieve a new reinvigoration of the union movement, of a real progressivism in the Marxist sense, or whatever sense you'd like to use? Lenin wrote on the limitations of trade unionism 100 years ago. As pointed out, we're living in a very different time when there's very little value left to extract from the system. What kind of strategy or positive program can each of the panelists offer us today? I'd like to hear more about that. Thank you.
I'd like to address that.
Okay, let's have you guys address it. And I also invite you to follow up on your brief disagreement about the Soviet Union as well, if that's of interest.
Yeah, I would be happy to try to address. I think that's an important question. Just to reiterate it, how to achieve the reinvigoration of the union movement? Well, I think that the place to start is to ask the question, how did the union movement become, this is definitely not a word, uninvigorated, or whatever you want to call it. The union movement is led by a bureaucracy which believes that its natural allies are the liberal wing of the bourgeoisie. Not always the liberal wing, but some wing of the bourgeoisie. That's the central character of the leadership of the unions today. And it is for that reason that constant blocks, coalitions, and alliances with capitalist politicians, billions of dollars are given by unions to support Democratic Party politicians here in California and in every blue state for sure. This characteristic of the union leadership has led to the grave weakening and crippling of the union, so that, 7 or 8% of workers in private industry are in unions today. In the 1950s, after World War II, it was something like 35%. So the central means to reinvigorate the union movement comes down to its leadership. My organization, it was spoken to a little bit in the first panel, supports numerous caucuses and individuals in a range of unions, longshore, healthcare, education, transit, who fight for replacing the current pro-capitalist leadership with a class struggle leadership, or a leadership with a class struggle vision that isn't going to be beholden to some kind of an alliance with the so-called Friends of Labor in the Democratic Party. So the key question really is one of a conception of the kind of leadership that the union movement needs. And I mentioned a few things in my short introductory remarks. A union leadership that would be one fighting for the mobilization of the working class in its own interest would do first of all, some very obvious things. There would be a general strike in Minneapolis. There's a lot of talk now about a general strike on February 23rd. It's mainly a lot of hot air because the central unions like the ATU have said they're not going to allow their members to go out and strike. But that's what a class struggle leadership would struggle to do. Or a simple thing like bringing out the masses of SEIU members to defend their own union president who's up on misdemeanor criminal charges in LA for being part of an ICE protest. You can list a whole bunch of examples of that, but that's the kinds of things that a class struggle leadership would do, but the current leadership doesn't do it because their whole vision is defined by what's acceptable in Sacramento or what's acceptable in Washington. If there's a Democrat in office, we'll stop there.
Thank you. Would either of you guys like to chime in? Yeah.
And I wouldn't say there's consensus here. You said that. I don't think so. For example, I think that the possibility of mobilization and unionization popular forces was in fact greater under the New Deal than otherwise. So just characterizing FDR and the New Deal as sort of what do you want to call it, oppressive or whatever you want, a capitalist formation. I think it's true they're the capitalists, but it doesn't get to the real issue, which is under what circumstances can you mobilize? Can you create unions? Can you create popular organizations? And I do think that under both FDR and under Mamdani, under Mamdani, I think that is more possible. I don't think that the characterization of him is simply a wing of the capitalists. Now, in fact, let me just get to this. You made a phrase. I'm in favor of the independent organization of the working class. I'm quoting you. I'm in favor of that. But what does that mean? In a world where private sector unionism is 6%, 10% otherwise, what does that mean? You can't just announce it. You have to build it. So actually, I didn't come here as an organization, but my organization is, if I have to say one, is Labor Notes. I think put the movement back in the labor movement, create a movement, expand it, and make it and do things. And I think that we're getting a glimpse of that today. I think under Trump, it's obviously being neutered in many different ways. But for example, I'll give you one example, and I'll shut up. The UAW did organize thousands of academic workers throughout America, obviously California, but also the Northeast. The leader of UAW, the UAW Region 9A, just elected, was Brandon Marcello, who created the union at Harvard, and they've been very vigorous in organizing. What did Region 9A do? It was the first. The first union or union region to come out for a ceasefire. In October of 2020, that was a big deal, for a ceasefire in Gaza, and then of course calling Gaza genocide. So it was the first union to do that, okay? And then it was the first union to come out in favor of Mamdani, and so I think, and they knew who Mamdani was. They knew what the problems were going to be, but they came out and did that. So I think that there is a possibility that for more of that. And that would mean, and that's what I mean by would be the independent organization of the working class. That's what that would mean. You got to make concrete about that, and I think that means unionization, militancy, organization, willingness to strike, etc. That's what it means. Right now, the nurses are striking in New York City. What do the hospitals say? They say, "Oh, we can't afford it. Trump's creating austerity," but they're fighting, they're mobilizing, and I'm happy to say that my son was just sent from Minneapolis to New York City to help that mobilization take place.
Yeah, I would say that what it requires, because we say, okay, we put a good leader in charge. He's smart and he knows the right things, and then he wills the union into the right position. I don't believe that will ever result in an actual independent organization. Unions at this point are fundamentally dependent. If you look, for instance, at the UAW, they require the government in order to carve out, for instance, we're not going to import Chinese cars, we're not going to import Mexican cars, and now they are doing that. That is a huge direct attack against UAW, which they can't deal with. Ford, Chevy, GM, those are fucking awful cars. If you're gonna buy a car and you've got the opportunity to buy a car that's cheap, you're not gonna buy an American car. So UAW can't sit there and say, we're gonna fight so that General Motors continue. No, it's nonsense. They have to make their own cars which are good. They have to have their own, for instance, Teamsters has to have its own shipping company, which can offer better, cheaper delivery services, which, telling you as someone who used to load trucks for UPS, not that hard. You just kick the box into the back of the truck and it smashes the TV. I remember getting told that I was an idiot for not tossing the TV as hard as I could against the wall because it's just gonna waste time. So, you start an actual warehouse that's, not just, here's the number, I'm gonna put all these boxes in here. You start an actual car company that isn't guaranteed sales by the US government. Well, now that's real independence, right? That's their own stuff, organized under those unions that they're drawing money from. The other issue is, okay, I'm a union leader, and I come up against the problem of, well, what can I get out of this circumstance, right? At this point, I'm dependent. There can only be so many factories for these cars because they're so awful that we can only produce so many. And we're probably going to be producing less and less every year regardless of this tariff removal. So they have to pick and choose what small benefits they get. And if you're a union leader, you're sitting there going, well, what if I was just corrupt and did money laundering? It's the same thing, right? I'm still going to be reducing the amount, but at least I'll get my piece and I can take care of myself. I see where things are going. I need a retirement. Fuck these other guys because I can't get anything for them anyway, right? If you want independence, I'm fighting for you because you're cashing my check, right? You are directly responsible for that factory. I mean, this is the Soviet model, right? This is not the, I'm going to argue with the boss and please give me a little, no, that's not independence.
Thank you. More questions from the floor? Go with,
You gotta get the woman.
can we go with
Another gender back there.
blonde hair in the back?
Sure. What's your question?
Yeah.
No, it's the.
So the comments from the panelists, both Nelson and Marcello, reflect exactly why the working class does not listen to the left and does not look to the left. How does the ACP and Nelson propose to advance the struggle for Black people in the brown struggle? I mean, come on, look outside. We are under attack by the Trump administration with this ICE raids. So how can we advance the struggle to defend immigrants, which is a question of right now, not look back into the 1800s or whatever progressivism meant during that time? Like, what is the question today? How can you advance the struggle to desegregate New York City, to desegregate LA, here in LA? I mean, come on. This is the city where we're in. Focus in the question of today. Like, this talk about your individual company and shipping, that, I'm sorry, but that is like way past my head. That's like a different planet that you're talking.
You guys can address that if you want to, or we can also take other questions.
Yes, no.
Are you interested in addressing it?
But I think I wrote in my book, Why Labor Unions Matter. I have the last chapter on how do you form a general strike. All general strikes are reluctantly led by trade union leaders, okay? Reluctantly. That's always the case, from Brazil to Poland to San Francisco and in Minneapolis, you're right, they are equivocating. That's right, the trade union leaders are, but it's on the agenda, and they're inching their way toward it. And there is in fact a social movement there in the streets. It's self-organized, following the ICE people around, and this thing is going to explode. And I think I'll make a prediction. Maybe you can come catch me. I think there's going to be a general strike. What is it? 6 days from today, and it's going to be massive. It's going to be not just the unions, but everyone. And I think it'll have a huge impact because and I think the union leadership, union leaders are always conservative because they want to preserve their organization, and most of the time conditions are terrible for the organization, so they're always conservative, they're always cautious, and so they're always behind when it comes to a movement that really wants something. But the organization is there. It does protect workers to a degree, and I think that the momentum now in Minneapolis is such that we're going to have a general strike on next Friday. And I think if it happens there, it's going to happen other places. And this is a very, very, and the key thing is the mobilization of people. That's the key thing, not what some trade union leader says. And that's happening right now.
On what basis, though?
Well, do you guys want to respond to that? I mean, the other panelists? The original question?
Yeah, I'll just say that, yes, unions are working to help that out. The ACP is a little tiny party. We can't snap our fingers and fix other things. We're focused narrowly on what we can do. But also, if you want unions to not be as conservative, they should be more independent. Then they will be leading that charge, and it won't have to wait and tail.
Any more questions from the floor? On the right here, Ismail.
Thank you, everybody. I didn't write the question down, so I'm going to try to be brief to formulate it. One of the questions that we prepared for this conference was over the legacy of the American Revolution and how the Progressive era may have been a revival of. I think the only panelist, I think it was Nelson, you harkened back to the French Revolution and the Bolsheviks, but you kind of leaped past the American Revolution. And I think in an earlier panel we had a discussion from the audience about the Civil War. Oh, further out? Is that better? Sorry, the popping is awful, I know. Okay, so we talked about the Civil War. And so I kind of think about the Progressive era, if you watch, one of the first 2 episodes of the Ken Burns documentary series on the Roosevelts, with TR, Teddy Roosevelt, being this Progressive era president, one of the key factors for him was he felt this responsibility for the people and that the state had to do something for the people. And I think it's hard to imagine today leftists embracing the American Revolution. In fact, it's often the case that it's hard. American Communist Party, of course, you embrace it openly. And so there's this question for me about how actually maybe it's not always the American Revolution that's the most important for people, but more so harkening back to the time when people started, like the state wanted to be responsible for the working class in a more explicit way. And so that's why I think there's a little bit of this motivation for the Progressive era. And that's why we're trying to think about it, whether or not it's revolutionary. And I kind of wanted to get a sense of how do you see it as a revival of the American Revolution, or is it a continuation of, if you see the American Revolution as a critical, problematic tradition, a bourgeois, that non-socialist, like whatever the criticism is. I think that's also something I want to hear each of the panelists speak to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now I see where you're coming from. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. The American Revolution, and then even more so the French Revolution, and they were connected. Now and then of course in Haiti as well. It's the age revolution. Yes, it's the bourgeois revolution. These are essentially bourgeois revolutions. Although really from then and through 1848 and even on to February of 1917, the bourgeoisie always lacks nerve. It doesn't have the nerve to really do it, and it requires the working class or some other subaltern groups to sort of give it a shove, as it were. But yes, I think that the conquest of bourgeois rights is progressive and is on the path to socialism ultimately. And my best example of bourgeois rights is procedure, judicial procedures, constitutionalization of the shop floor. Of the shop floor. That is the grievance procedure. Now, I have written tomes denouncing the bureaucratization of the grievance procedure. I have. But it is a way of saying that you're equal under the law. And given the racial and gendered and ethnic divisions within the working class and hierarchies, especially from today as well, we have a new sets of divisions involving, immigrants, etc. The acquisition of equal rights under the law, under the contract, in the shop is a definite, is progressive. It's progressive. It gives people the sense of citizenship, and that is on the road to even more radical things. So I think the American Revolution, which has many problems, of course, it's, in terms of slavery, in terms of the destruction of the Indian nations. I mean, Ken Burns in his recent thing, he actually showed a lot of that. Nevertheless, that's what it was. It was a bourgeois revolution, and ultimately, I think, as Bernard Bailyn, a great historian, put it this way: before the American Revolution, no one talked about the abolition of slavery. No one, North or South. After the American Revolution, it was always on the agenda in every state.
Would the other panelists like to address the question? I mean, you addressed it to all the panelists, right? Yeah, if they're interested.
Marcello, you're on.
Oh, well, I largely agree with what he said. I would also like to add that the massive land redistribution that occurred in the United States with the movement west, Jacksonian democracy or so. Is it Jefferson or Jackson? Remind me.
Jacksonian democracy, that's the phrase you use.
Jacksonian democracy. Now, Jefferson, Jackson, they move west and they give land to people. Totally unheard of. Now, the 1800s is characterized by taking that land back. But redistributing land to the large swaths of the American people was a hugely progressive thing as well, and would absolutely characterize a new peasant movement within the United States. For instance, reparations for 2008, when so many people lost their homes, on and on. Of course, that's just sloganeering, but it's certainly a very progressive addition.
Thank you. More questions from the floor? Drew?
I had a question surrounding the panel's emergent focus on unionism here. I'm wondering, there's a lot of denunciation of union leadership for being bureaucratized or for being cowards from Bert's perspective. Not cowards, but
No. That's not what I said.
From being liberals, etc. But I just want to ask, since all of these union leaders are at least, de jure voted in, what is the kernel of truth in these union leaders, right? Like, why do they keep getting elected by their people, and how perhaps does that relate to what progressivism means, world historically, or within capitalism?
Well, the issue is the conditions that these unions are in. They're independent formations. They're reliant upon the state in a lot of different ways, and they're also reliant on the current system. So if we denounce them as being, I don't know, whatever slogan you come up with, opportunist, right, whatever, that's missing the point that whoever you put into that position is going to have to make the same deals. Right? There will be people who are better, who understand their position and want to work through it in a more productive way, and there will be people who will be worse. But ultimately, as these unions are totally dependent, they have to make the deals that they have to make. And you can't really sit there and say that they're doing it wrong. Right? It's only that they lack the vision, which is seems insane, but the vision to reindustrialize the country themselves and build their own factories, which is hard. So I don't blame them for not doing that.
Yeah, I'll try to, all right. Well, again, I think it's a good question. If the leaders are so terrible, not cowardly, I didn't say that. Why do they keep getting voted in? One of the things that has progressively degenerated in the union movement in the last decades is workers even feeling that they want to push their organization forward and participate in its life. So if you know anything about unions, you'll know that a lot of unions don't even have meetings. And a lot of unions that do have meetings, if you know a bit about how it works, hardly anybody goes to them. And there's another kind of current of reaction to, I don't mean political reaction, a way that workers react to this also has been to turn their backs on their unions and to say they don't want to pay union dues anymore because they don't think the unions do very much for them. So this is all a very contradictory and not good situation for pushing working class struggle forward because the unions are the elementary defense organizations of the working class. So the question is, a lot of union leaders get voted in because there isn't much of an opposition to them, or a lot of the workers are so fed up with what's going on that they don't even participate in it. There's another thing too, you can get a liberal union leader to come in. Like the guy that heads up the UAW today, what's his, Sean?
Sean Fain.
Thank you, Sean Fain. Sean Fain has the reputation of being a progressive union leader, and I think at some point he was probably pretty popular in the UAW. But he managed to kind of undermine and scuttle the strike that I think was about 3 or 4 years ago, I don't remember exactly when it was, by refusing to call out the whole union to fight against the big three. They made some gains, but compared to what was possible and necessary, it was not a step forward for the unions. I'll give another example. It's something that Nelson referred to a few minutes ago. It's about the union you were referring to, of a union leader who pushed for a ceasefire in Gaza. I don't remember what union you were talking about.
UAW.
Oh, that was the UAW.
Region
So
9.
was Sean Fain.
Region 9.
Region 9, okay, all right. I was thinking about that when you said it. Okay, ceasefire in Gaza. Well, there are different ways to look at a ceasefire. Certainly, the Palestinians would have been very happy not to have the 500-pound bombs dropping on their hospitals, or 5,000-pound bombs, whatever the case may be. So there's, an elementary yearning not to be killed and slaughtered by the IDF. There's that. There was another side to it, which is very problematic, which is that large sections of the American ruling class, particularly in the Democratic Party, were also for a ceasefire. So in a way, for the unions to come out for a ceasefire really was going very much in the direction of what was, kind of at that point, current popular thinking within the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So here's what I would say. I was talking earlier about the need for an alternative labor leadership based on a class struggle program. If you really want to ceasefire in Gaza, that's going to have lasting, permanent meaning. What would be necessary to do is mobilize labor for a labor boycott of weapons to Israel. There were little movements like that in some European countries, for example, in Italy. They had problems, they were connected to the Catholic Church and whatnot, so those weren't independent working class movements. But here in America, that would have been the thing that a class struggle opposition in whatever, the UAW or the IAM, Boeing workers, for example, who work in the defense industry, fighting for labor to see, or Longshore is a classic example. My comrade Julie talked about the IAM not stopping the shipment of weapons to Israel during the IAM strike last year. That kind of thing is what labor needs to be doing, what a labor militant opposition would be doing to advance the interests of the working class in alliance with the oppressed all over the world. But just simply saying ceasefire really kind of begs the question on what program. It could be very liberal to do that, or it could have very militant significance if it's connected with labor boycotts.
Nelson, do you have anything to say on why society keeps electing the unions? The same union?
What was your question?
Do you have anything to say on the question
I
about?
answer it, yeah. I'll answer that. Just look, in October of 2023, to call for a ceasefire was something radical, and all hell broke over the UAW Region 9A for doing that. Just make that clear. That was not a liberal thing to do in October of 2023. And by the way, UAW Local 4811, did march on campuses demanding that the University of California stop cooperating with arms sales to Israel. Okay, here's the thing about unions. As C. Wright Mills said, union leaders are managers of discontent. They mobilize it and then they sit on it. And the reason for that is that unions are not revolutionary organizations. I mean, I wish they were. Some places they have been, Spain, 1936. Some places they have, Brazil to a degree in the late 80s. But they aren't. Basically, they aren't. And it's true that the law, hems them in that fashion. But you have to recognize that. That's what unions are. Now that doesn't mean that I don't know, maybe I should ask you the question, are you for the abolition of trade unions in America because given that structure? I'm not, because consciousness is transforms itself in incremental fashion. And people who have a sense of security, at least in their job, a minimal sense of it, can then take the next step. The worst thing is to be insecure. That leads to passivity and sticking your head in a hole. So no, and the reason that union leaders do become conservative, bureaucratic, etc., is because most of the time unions are under attack in unfavorable conditions, and they see their job as, I got to preserve this organization, and how the hell am I going to do that? So that most of the time, yes, there's a tendency for union leaders to be conservative, undemocratic, etc. But I think the existence of a union does provide a basis for individuals to in moments of opportunity, which I think we now have in Minneapolis, for example, to burst forth. Or we had that by the way, in West Virginia in 2018, when there was a de facto general strike of every educator in West Virginia, including from the superintendents down to the janitors. There was a general strike, all 55 counties. Why? Because it was a lousy, weak union. But the union was the basis for that, which then was infused with militancy and radicalism, and it turned over basically for about 2 weeks, it had a general strike flavor to it in that state.
Thank you. More questions from the floor? You've had your hand up for a while.
Is there a microphone?
This guy.
Question is for Marcello. You keep repeating this idea about building, as I understand, a parallel industrial complex in the US, since the existing industry is in decay and it creates increase of value, as you're saying. This gives me a very curious kind of Joseph Stalin meets Ayn Rand vibe. And the question is, wouldn't you need a whole new industrial complex? I mean, I see that you can do delivery service, maybe independently, but building a car, I presume it's not that easy. If you start building something like that, wouldn't it get entangled in the existing mode of production?
So the question really is, when I talk about this, is that when we're looking at the current state of unions, they are on their way out. If for instance, you asked the question, are you for the abolition of trade unions? I'm not. I would say that if you were, all you would have to do is wait. Trade unions are suffering from the problem where, well, if you're part of UAW, you just have to wait a few years with the restriction on automotive imports, and GM, Chevy, Ford, they are out of business. So it's not a question of, well, isn't this too hard? Isn't this crazy? This is a question of the self-preservation of these unions. Now, what it looks like to make your own car, that's a really difficult question. Now, the UAW certainly could answer part of that question because they're already building them. One of the problems, of course, is the regulations that go into it, which make it far more expensive to make cars here than it does in a lot of places in the world. Now, they have a lot of labor, they have a lot of money, they can leverage things in different ways. If it ends up being that they make cars in order to survive, their own cars, that would be cool. It could be anything else, right? But it's producing value again within the country.
Is it competitive though? Like, would those cars compete?
They would probably have to. Now, at the same time, if you're thinking about the union model is, okay, you are making this car. If you if you go to a labor meeting in UAW and you're driving a Toyota, that doesn't go over well, right? So if you're an American and something like this starts happening, you are going to have a lot of pressure to buy something like this. And if it is a pretty good version of a Honda Civic, it's not the best, people are going to buy those because people already buy Honda Civics. So cost, this kind of thing, the competitiveness, there's a social angle to it as well. Now, this is all speculative, right? You're asking me a speculative question. I am imagining a scenario in which something like this directly takes place. Now, the question is, how do these unions hang on? And the only way that a union hangs on is through the production of value. That's where the union comes from. And so they have to return to doing that. The idea that they make their own cars is essentially an illustration of what that would look like.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Bert and Nelson, do you have any comment on industrialization?
I do. The 2023 UAW 22, when the strike of 22, I think it's 22. Here's what the demand. The demand was not just for more money. Although it was, and they got that. And by the way, it was a smart idea to have this, to pick out these factories one at a time, because it was all three manufacturers being picked out, not just one, and that made it more difficult for the managers to figure out what to do. It was a smart strategy for that time. The other demand was for the unionization and the funding of battery plants and electrical vehicle green transition and really what it was the demand for was and the reason that Joe Biden showed up on the picket line was because there was a planning initiative in his administration to transition to green production of automobiles, and the UAW was behind that, not just in some rhetorical sense, but in the sense that if we get high wages for EV workers and battery workers, then the working class as a whole is going to endorse the idea of a green transition. Trump said exactly the opposite. He said, "Oh, you'll ruin your jobs," and so he spoke at a non-union parts plant, which was linked to the gasoline engine. So that was what the strike was about, and it was successful in two ways. One, every single non-union auto factory in the South, Toyota, Nissan, you name it, they all raised wages dramatically as soon as the UAW won. And that was a strike on behalf of the entire working class, okay? And secondly, it gave an impetus to really social planning. And I'm in favor of social planning, and in such a way that it would make it more advantageous for the UAW to organize in the future. Now, Trump ruined all that, but that was what was going on at the time.
Okay, thank you. Do we have more questions from the floor? Please. Yeah.
Well, since we were having a lot of talk about unions, but what's that? Yeah. Okay. I mean, there's a lot of talk about unions, but then like the reference of like what those unions are for, like, is the working class. But I don't think we've kind of gotten deeper about like the exact contours of like what the state of the working class is in the U.S. today. So if anyone can like elaborate and particularly address like the role of like migrant labor in that.
Who would like to address that first?
I spoke. I don't know.
Yeah, sure. So the issue of the working class today has a lot less to do with migrant labor, although that impacts it, and more to do with the increasing deindustrialization of the United States and the falling rate of profit. Now, what that means is if there is less profit in the system, well, we have to shrink. So this is the imperialist or financial outlook. If there is less of something, I can charge more for it and I can create more rent. And so they accelerate this process. That's really the state of the working class at this point, is that it is hanging on and it needs direction. That's supposed to be the role of the Communist Party. If we can get our party to the point where we can offer that solution and they can make progress on it and go forwards with it, then we would subordinate ourselves to the movement that would inevitably come out of that. Because, we are supposed to be representing them and not commanding them and so forth, right? So the state of them, they don't have a party, they don't have a future, and they are waiting for some kind of solution, and at the same time fighting for some kind of solution. Now, as he mentioned with the UAW plant, they're moving somewhat in that direction, and they might do that themselves. But as he also mentioned, it needs some level of central planning and coordination between these different groups. Right? The more coordination between the vast sectors of the working class, the more it becomes, instead of a movement of auto workers, a movement of the general populace of the working class. And it can actually elevate the entire nation.
I just want to gloss that. You said nation. Is the aim of the union building a global socialist movement? Or is it like national, like running back the acquisition of land that you described Jacksonian democracy bringing and wealth to America?
So when I use terminology in that way, that is what it would be doing directly. Now, indirectly, if we're producing things here, then we're not reliant upon these foreign colonies. And if we're producing in excess here, then we could be helping those people. Now, the way in which I'm supposed to be in a room full of leftists, right? The way in which imperialism works is you export capital out of the country. The whole point of socialism is to concentrate capital back within the country and put it in command, the working class in command of it. That's the point, right? Now, it becomes a social function and not a function of money making, because now it is under the command of the working class. When you talk about the internationalism of such a system, there are certain dependencies that people need in order to keep things going. There are interrelations between different countries which inevitably occur. And as this, so for instance, what did the Soviet Union do after World War II? Is it started building trade networks with other countries in order to support itself. Right now, it didn't do that on the greatest of terms, right? This is the political question within socialism, but it was still a socialist country, right? And so it had an international character in that. And of course, America would have an international character, as it does now, right? Would we say that capitalism is nationalistic in any kind of way, right? It exports capital, it deindustrializes the nation. And so the question of oh, this is a nationalistic thing. This is a problem of undialectical thinking, right? If you assert just direct nationalism, ultimately you're supposing something else, right? You can't see a nation within a vacuum and so forth. And so if you're, for instance, a neo-Nazi and you say, oh, the strength of the nation, really what you mean is we're going to go out and conquer other people and so forth. So if we say we're going to build things back up here, that means we're pulling away from the rest of the world.
Bert and Nelson, do you guys have anything to say about that international versus national?
Well, I would like to speak to the question of migrant labor, which you asked a couple of minutes ago. I'd like to echo the protest of my comrade at the back of the room a few minutes ago. Here we are, sitting in a room of leftists, and we're talking about the question of migrant labor as if it's an abstract economic question. Whereas the Trump administration is invading one city after the next with federal troops in order to deport immigrant labor. So the real question here isn't an abstract economic question about value or where migrant labor is employed or any of that kind of thing. It is what are leftists supposed to do to defend immigrants? That's the question here. And that really gets us back to what we've been talking about the whole time, which is how to do that. When the National Guard and Marines and the FBI all invaded LA not too many months ago, we thought it was necessary to fight for a perspective of mobilizing organized labor where the real power is, to be able to defend the immigrant population, because the interests of immigrants and labor go hand in hand. If Trump deports 100,000 immigrants, the next thing he is going to do is send federal troops against striking workers. So their interests are one and the same. So that's what we need to be thinking about, not a general abstract question of the economy, but how does the working class, what does the working class and what kind of leadership is necessary for the working class to start to defend immigrants and thereby defend itself? And that's the whole perspective I've been trying to lay out here, and my comrade Julie earlier tried to lay out here. Liberalism is a roadblock to all that, because liberals want to keep it all nice and tidy within the system. They don't want general strikes to defend immigrants, even if they're not, anti-immigrant, racists or whatever. But they don't want to unleash class struggle, because that could challenge the whole system. That can shake the whole edifice of U.S. capitalism. So that's what we really should be thinking about: how to mobilize labor to defend immigrants and to be able to defend itself.
I agree.
David, do you want to chime in on that?
One more question.
Yeah, we have about time for one more question, let's stack some.
So let's try to get the last question in closing remarks.
Okay, so this next question will also be an opportunity for you guys to fold in your closing remarks on your overall thoughts, so you can answer the question and also close out. Do you want to stack questions?
No, let's just take a question and.
Okay, we take your question, David.
Yeah, the historical reference that comes to my mind is the Palmer raids, during the war to end all wars, right? That's what I like to call it, the First World War.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of the early rise of J. Edgar Hoover, and Palmer was his boss, and people like Emma Goldman and a lot of other people got deported during that time, any kind of leftist types. So that's, I think, the most recent. There may be other ones. I mean, obviously there's the entire McCarthy era, right? But the Palmer raids, I think, represent a much starker, or much more close to what we might be looking at coming up here.
Okay, that's more of a comment. Can we take your question?
No, I guess, yeah, more of a comment, you're right.
Yeah. we take your question, please?
Yeah. Is my volume good?
Crystal.
Lovely. I guess since we talked so much about unions and like the previous power of union, or like the power of unions kind of being a possible like radicalizing force or like a pushing force for the working class, I guess put simply, like how do we kind of stop capitalists from crushing such a radicalization of unions? And how do we make such a radicalization not just like a local or national thing, but also like a international thing of like the united workers of the world, I guess?
All right, great. So we'll have you guys respond to that and fold in your closing remarks.
Actually, the best analogy is the early 1930 deportations of Mexican Americans, especially in California, but also Chicago, which was done. It was organized by local sheriffs and people like that. But about 500,000 Mexican Americans were put on trains and just shipped to Mexico. Anyway, on your question, here is where I do agree with the reason that in the 30s we got unions, at least the Wagner Act, which was a way of facilitating them, and it did for a while, was that capitalists and Democrats, Republicans, they were afraid of something worse. They were afraid there was a specter of chaos, chaos and violence, and maybe not revolution, but all sorts of crap. And so how do you regularize that? Well, they created the Wagner Act. So what you need is the specter today of, something more. So when it comes to Starbucks, for example, I'm in favor of property damage. I'm in favor of scaring Starbucks management to think these young 20-something who are of all sorts of various gender and racial and political persuasions. We don't know what the hell they're going to do, so we better form a union. Okay, so the unions are created when capitalists are afraid of something worse, and that was the case in the 1930s. Now, the result of that may be, and we've had this discussion of the kind of containment of the unions, but that is, and so I think we need, a sort of a sense of outrage and chaos and potential violence. I don't know about that because that works for them. But anyway, we need that sense so that they'll say, okay, we'll give you a union or something. I think that was part of the methodology of it.
Who else would like to respond to that?
Sure.
And remember, you can fold in your closing remarks and your final thoughts on the whole subject of progressivism and socialism in the left.
Well, if you're talking about an international policy, I think what has characterized this age we are in is in national sovereignty movements. We could say the Chavista movement in Venezuela is a national sovereignty movement. Even Putin, more or less, was a sovereignty movement. There's a sovereignty movement even in China. We could talk about all these kinds of things where we say, okay, we need to protect what it is that we're doing in whatever country. Now, what matters to that is the production of value, and to make that less abstract, the production of things that people need and food. And so to bring things back into a more concrete lens and say, well, if you are producing things that you need in your own country, then you don't have to worry, right? Why would I invade and take something else that I need, that I already have? Or if I need one piece's part from this place over here, I'm only focused on satisfying these needs and not in this abstract resource abstraction that we have here with capitalism, where we say, okay, I need more because I transform this into money and commodity fetishism and so forth, right? It's just focusing on, okay, well, we have enough clothes, right? Oh, we have enough cars, we have enough whatever it is we need and whatever it is that people want. If we have that kind of movement here, that will inspire other movements in the same way that the Chavista movement inspired other movements. It's just a necessary consequence of anything sort of taking place in history.
Thank you. Bert, you have a response to that in closing remarks?
I think what I'd like to do is focus just on my closing remarks. I mean, obviously unions are defense organizations, whether they operate in a national or an international context. But I'd like to say something a little bit different to conclude what I'd like to contribute to this panel. One of the main, if not the main, method by which the capitalist class remains in power in the United States is racial oppression. Black people are at the bottom of society and have been since they were brought here 400 years ago as slaves. And they remain at the bottom of society. So any struggle to regenerate the labor movement requires fighting against black oppression, because what the ruling class does is pit one racial group against another. If black people are fighting for greater freedoms or measures of economic equality, whatever the case may be, the ruling class says that can only happen if it comes out of the hides of white people. And it's that racial cleft, that divide, that helps keep American capitalism afloat. So if you don't challenge racial oppression, you can't make, a revolution is completely impossible in America. You can just forget about it. And that's why I raised in my initial remarks that Mamdani is at best indifferent to the question of racial oppression in New York City. And in so doing, he, in his own way, shows his allegiance to the ruling class. And actually, to get back to something Nelson said very early on, that is one of the red lines that Mamdani is not willing to cross, to broach the question, how are we going to defend the black population? For example, against NYPD. Well, he's obviously shown he's not willing to do that because he's chosen, what's her name, Jessica Tisch as his police commissioner. That's a statement against black freedom if there ever was one. So I'll just finish with one just final summary comment. It is necessary in the unions and for those who want to build a revolutionary party more broadly in America, which of course is going to have militant unionists in it, it is really crucial to take up the question of black freedom and fight for uniting the working class against the efforts of the politicians and the establishment, Wall Street and all the rest of those evil things, to keep the working class divided against itself. So that's kind of my conclusion of this. If you want to fight for socialism in America, think about the need to unite. Think of the fight for black freedom is the fight for the regeneration of the labor movement.
Thank you, Bert, and a round of applause for all of our panelists, please.